Lynching became a vicious tool of racial control in America during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but it first emerged as a form of vigilante retribution used to enforce popular justice on the western frontier. In the western territories in the early 19th century, the individual desire for revenge was high, government was absent or underdeveloped, and public support for lynching was widespread. Notably, lynching did not initially mean killing, and vigilante regulators often punished thieves, highwaymen, swindlers, and card sharks with tarring and feathering, beatings, and floggings. Beginning in the 1830s and continuing in the decades following the Civil War, lynching became more synonymous with hanging. The first broadly publicized incident of lethal lynching occurred in Madison County, Mississippi in 1835, after a fabricated story of a planned slave uprising sparked local panic and resulted in the hangings of 2 white men and several enslaved black people. Followed that same year by a notorious lynching of 5 gamblers in Vicksburg, Mississippi, these killings marked a change in American mob violence. Whereas in the era of the American Revolution, mobs had rarely killed their victims, the 1835 riots claimed at least 71 lives. Even as lynchings became more frequently deadly, they differed greatly by region. An individual subject to a frontier lynching typically was accused of a crime such as murder or robbery, given some form of process and trial, and hanged without any additional torture or foul play. Southern lynchings, on the other hand, were more commonly extrajudicial and employed to defend slavery. Between 1830 and 1860, Southern mobs killed an estimated 130 white individuals and at least 400 enslaved black people. Most were lynched under suspicion of conspiring to mount a slave uprising, a growing but largely unsubstantiated fear among whites in slave-holding states. In addition, Southern lynchings of African Americans were distinct from lynchings of whites and often featured extreme brutality such as burning, torture, mutilation, and decapitation of the victim. Lynchings were rituals of collective violence that served as highly effective tools to reinforce the institution and philosophy of white racial superiority. Lynch mobs intended to instill fear in all African Americans, to enforce submission and racial subordination, and to emphasize the limits of black freedom. Through lynching, whites demonstrated to black people that any transgression of social and racial boundaries, real or imagined, placed the lives of all African Americans at risk. According to Paul Ricoeur, precisely because history has objectivity as a project, it can pose the limits of objectivity as a specific problem. Historians address themselves to distrustful readers who expect from them not only that they narrate, but that they authenticate their narrative. Conceptualization, the search for objectivity, and critical reexamination thus mark the 3 steps in making explanation in history autonomous in relation to the self-explanatory character of narrative. On interpretation, Ricoeur believes that there is a triple correspondence between the body, houses, and the cosmos, which makes the pillars of a temple and our spinal column symbolic of one another, just as there are correspondences between a roof and the skull, breath and wind, etc. This triple correspondence is also the reason why thresholds, doors, bridges, and narrow pathways outlined by the very act of inhabiting space and dwelling in it correspond to the homologous kinds of passage which rites of initiation help us to cross over in the critical moments of our pilgrimage through life, moments such as birth, puberty, marriage, and death. Such is the logic of correspondences which binds discourse in the universe of the sacred. We might even say that it is always by means of discourse that this logic manifests itself, for if no myth narrated how things came to be, and if there were no rituals which reenacted this process, the sacred would remain unmanifested. Regarding representation, Ricoeur believes that we may already apprehend that representation is not limited to the physiognomy of buildings and spaces, but relates more closely to the situational structure and meaning of architecture. Indeed, it is in this relation that the nature and degree of architectural reality can be established. Representation more or less coincides with the essential nature of making, and in particular with the making of our world. In the original Greek sense, making as poiesis is the bringing into being of something that did not previously exist. This bringing into being is a creative step that transforms the open field of creative possibilities into a representation articulated by gesture, word, image, or concept. He further states that order is always constituted in the communicative space of a particular culture as a whole. When the culture itself is reduced to its most elementary characteristics and is represented in a manner compatible with technical thinking, then and only then is it possible to believe that technology is far more than a method, that it is a world in itself. Wherever technology reaches its real fulfillment, it transcends into architecture. In one sense, the gray zone is a metaphor for a deep discontinuity in modern culture. In another sense, it is a metaphor for the problematic attempts to resolve the discontinuity from a single relatively narrow position. In his interpretation theory, Ricoeur says that one metaphor calls for another, and each one stays alive by conserving its power to evoke the whole network. Regarding the gray zone, Ricoeur posits the arbitrary nature of the relation between the sphere of experience and the sphere of concepts or ideas is the main characteristic of the gray zone. It is a source of an unprecedented freedom to produce new works, but also of an overwhelming relativism, loss of meaning, and narrowing range of common references, and as a result of a general cultural malaise. The nature of this malaise can easily be illustrated by the dilemma facing most contemporary architects. On the one hand, it is assured that true creative architecture should be free of historical and other unnecessary cultural references in order to be as original and unique as possible. And yet, on the other hand, it is expected that the results should be universally understood, appreciated, and accepted. On communicative space, Ricoeur believes the attempt to understand the conditions under which representation contributes to the enhancement of our experience is motivated not so much by intellectual curiosity as by an inherited sense of reality asserting itself, very often against our will. We do not have to look far for examples which are easily found in our own discipline. From everyday experience, we know how wide the gap is between the best possible delineation of a project and the built result. The real intention is most often present in the margin between the design and what is explicitly specified. Each project rests on a network of communication that involves the silent language of craftsmanship and skills, drawings, sketches, and other visual representations, as well as verbal descriptions and instructions. The best possible documentation of a project is only a part of the communication needed for its realization. Attempts to eliminate secondary communication and reduce the process of design and building to that which can be specified a priori are altogether problematic. Attesting to their limits is the fact that most projects do not speak for themselves but require additional explanation. The discrepancy between the a priori representation and the result, the inhabited space, is even more apparent in the concrete experience of a particular space. We do not need specialized knowledge to see how markedly the experience of a space transcends what has been established beforehand. The scale of the space, the texture of materials, the presence and movement of light, the plenitude and simultaneous presence of everything that is visible in the space. These are some of the elements, phenomena, that cannot be directly represented and yet constitute the very essence of any particular space. Ricoeur continues by saying the topology, orientation, and physiognomy of space constitute a unity. The visible aspects of space, its physiognomy, depend on orientation. And orientation in turn depends on the topology character of the surrounding world. The sequence of relationships and dependencies brings us closer to understanding the phenomenon of continuity and its identifiable manifestations. Imagination has a different depth of duration, temporality. It is not stable enough to be explored. Indeed, most of our energy and attention is spent merely sustaining its presence. That imagination is transitory and vulnerable, and perception is more deeply rooted and stable, can be taken as a key for understanding the rest of our experience. On the level of representation, Ricoeur says, the tension between imaginative articulation and perceptual embodiment becomes the main structuring principle of culture as a whole. This principle is very close to what modern anthropology has described as a law of relief. Relief is a deep-seated tendency in human life to move beyond the immediacy of the given situation, to concentrate on the typical and the essential. In everyday experience, we do not perceive things in their entirety. Instead, in the course of our development, the perceptual field becomes largely symbolic. Regarding narrativity, Ricord says that memory was brought to both language and works by means of narrative, by the act of putting things into narrative. The transition from memory to narrative is necessary in that sense. To recollect in a private way as in a public way is to declare that I was there. The witness says, I was there. And this declarative nature of memory fits in with accounts, testimonies, but also with a narrative through which I say to others what I have experienced. On time and built space, the time of the narrative comes into play at the time of rupture and suture between physical time and psychological time, the latter described by Augustine in the Confessions as distended, a distension of the soul between what he called the present of the past, memory, the present of the future, expectation, and the present of the present, attention. The time of the narrative is therefore a mixture of this experienced time and of that of clocks, chronological time framed by calendar time, with all astronomy behind it. At the root of narrative time, there is this mixture of simple instant, which is a break in universal time, and of the living present where there is only one present. Now, Ricord also says that built space is a sort of mixture between places of life that surround the living body and a three-dimensional geometrical space in which each point is some place. Some place is also, one might say, simultaneously measured in Cartesian space. Geometrical space, all the points may be, thanks to Cartesian coordinates, deduced from other points, and place of life, site. Following the example of the present, which is the node of narrative time, the site is the node of space that we create, that we build. Prefiguration. The narrative of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice was practiced nearly 2 centuries ago, when the first lynching occurred in the 1880s, as evidenced by the stories passed down from the victims' surviving families, as well as by the mobs of white men, women, and children who gathered for public lynchings, often posing with the person before or after the terroristic acts. Over time, narratives have been exchanged on these former lives, and those stories have been brought forth today through the work of the Equal Justice Initiative. Ricord argues that before any architectural project, humankind has built because it has inhabited. In this respect, it is pointless to ask oneself if inhabiting precedes building. In this case, humankind did not consider the black bodies of men, women, and children. On the contrary, they were disregarded as a people. As a people, they inhabited space in a time where they were no longer wanted. The fact that they even existed, regardless of where their beings lived, they inhabited the land, and their existence and later demise is what birthed the idea to give them a collective home. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, located in Montgomery, Alabama. However, in order to build the memorial, the architects had to understand the need for building. Ricord further argues that the need for building comes hand in hand with the vital need to inhabit. It is therefore from the inhabiting building complex that we must begin, even if we must later give priority to construction at the level of configuration, and perhaps inhabit it again at the level of refiguration, because it is inhabiting which the architectural project redesigns and which we are going to reread. On configuration, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum speak to emplotment as they make stories with events. They speak to intelligibility as they use narratives to clarify lives. And they speak to intertextuality, as both spaces have intentional arrangement of details. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice was conceived out of a lack of knowledge of wrongs done to more than 4,000 men, women, and children, with the goal of creating a sober, meaningful site where people can gather and reflect on America's history of racial inequality. According to Mass Design Group, the architectural firm that designed the memorial, the Equal Justice Initiative, the memorial's parent organization, conducted an extensive investigation into terror lynchings that occurred throughout 12 southern states within the United States between the Reconstruction period and World War II. The investigation is known to be one of the most thorough of all times. The United States has not fully recognized the long-term impact of slavery, as well as the racial terror, lynchings, and segregation, all of which has left a permanent societal scar, specifically affecting African Americans, evidenced by continuous exclusionary practices, ongoing struggles in areas such as socioeconomics, healthcare, and education, and overt discrimination. Through collaboration with Mass Design Group, the Equal Justice Initiative worked to collect soil from sites within communities where lynchings occurred. The process, known as the Community Remembrance Project, was developed as a way for communities to confront historical injustices faced by lynching victims. Residents in communities across the country did so by participating in the commemoration of the lives taken at the hands of white men. The Mass Design Group emphasizes that the soil collection process was strongly rooted in place and was a prelude to the building of the memorial. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the first project of its kind to be created by Mass Design Group, rests on 6 acres of land and is the first ever memorial for lynching victims in the United States. Refiguration, recounted time, and constructed space. Exchange their meanings. Regarding the narrative, Record states that it does not complete its journey within the enclosure of the text, but in its counterpart, the reader, whom he calls the forgotten protagonist of structuralism, further emphasizing that text has the power of illuminating the life of the reader, of discovering, of revealing the hidden, the unsaid of a life, to reveal as a way of truth, and to transform. In doing so, the text extends outside of itself. The memorial was designed with the anticipation of how the public would inhabit the space. Mass Design Group carefully constructed the space to consider the needs of its permanent residents, its revolving visitors, and visitors' expectations. Receptive and active inhabiting. Record says these elements imply a careful rereading of the urban environment, a continuous relearning of the juxtaposition, and thus also of life stories of which the monuments and all the buildings carry the trace. To make these traces not only residues, but testimonies of the past that is no longer, but which once was. To save the having been of the past in spite of its being no longer. This is what the rock that endures can do. He would say that the memorial requires a careful reading and then a rereading. As readers, we are continuously learning, reading something differently with each visit. Forgetting and forgiveness entwined with memory. Each presents a distinct challenge. With forgetting, the issue of memory and faithfulness to the past. With forgiveness, guilt and reconciliation with the past. Forgetting remains a threat to the phenomenology of memory and of the epistemology of history. If we forget, is our memory a failed memory, or does forgetfulness arrive out of the lack to be truthful with remembrances? Maybe the issue lies in forgiveness. Slavery, post-Reconstruction lynchings of black bodies continuing into the mid-20th century. A forgotten past. Time. Space. By participating in the memorial space, readers face forgotten historical events, visions and minds captivated by each monument's existence and eternal grasp. To not recall is to forget. To forget allows failure of memory, the forgetting of harms suffered. Memory is not a duty. The work of memory is a requirement of life. Yet memory is not possible without mourning. Frantz Fanon says that the disaster of the man of color lies in the fact that he was enslaved. The disaster and the inhumanity of the white man lie in the fact that somewhere he has killed man. As a man of color, Fanon further says he wants only one thing, that the tool never possessed the man, that the enslavement of man by man cease forever, that is, of one by another, that it be possible for him to discover and to love man wherever he may be. No attempt, Fanon says, must be made to encase man, for it is his destiny to be set free. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice and its sister site, the Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, are both texts with rich historical narratives. Within the walls of the Legacy Museum, which is the former warehouse where enslaved black people were imprisoned, visitors will experience mimesis on every level. The walls, the flooring. Video testimonies of the falsely imprisoned tell the tales of survivors from recent years. Interactive maps. Old telephone booths with technologically enhanced videos whereby visitors listen to the stories of prisoners. These are a few details that call for reader interaction. All are works of art. Whereas both structures demonstrate poiesis, one does so by making an even bolder statement, by telling the tale of black bodies that were excluded from society. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice is poiesis from a majestic standpoint, bringing into being something that has never existed anywhere else in the world. The walls are all different. Some are wooden with vertical slits, some are concrete, and others are formed in combination of the concrete and cord and steel beams. The textuality provides a transition to remembrance. The wood and cord and steel, both refusing industrial techniques by ushering in modernity, carry traces of remembrances, with the cord and steel representing the lynched bodies and their tears. The rust streaks and stained droplets are signifiers of remembrance. This memorial is home for the traces of residues that were intentionally erased, excluded from the forefront of United States history, nearly forgotten. The lives of thousands of souls, known and unknown, which once were, will already always remain alive in memory, elevated above the stronghold which suppressed them long ago. They now live within the sanctuary of the crying building, leaving tears with the coming of the rains. A sealed glass box of soil, elevated by cordon steel, represents the dislocated bodies in one collective space, the exiled soil now serving as the reversal of unrootedness. The weight of this experience is felt throughout the space, no matter the time of day, yet the mood at night was heavier as the darkness of night and tallness of the giant bodies lingered, some hovering overhead. The spirits could be felt, especially upon nearing the crying wall. During the day, the space was receptive, much calmer, as visitors walked about educating themselves, searching for family members. The memorial was designed to invoke pause, and with good reason. One could not walk through the space hurriedly. The intent is to study and study again and again so as not to forget what is meant to be remembered. Although I was not present during the lynchings of more than 4,000 bodies, through this reenactment, I was there. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Consider ways in which you could interact with the lives of those who were enslaved, who may have been lynched, whose memories have been all but suppressed until the Equal Justice Initiative gave birth to their permanency. How will you choose to read and reread the memorial?